very, very sad and very ironical that he was shut down by Sisi after really what I thought he had done was shattered a taboo. Because before Bassem Youssef, it seemed to me that in Egypt, going back to perhaps, it started in the ages, but anything that was claimed to be a real assertion of Islam, of Islamic values, couldn't be challenged. And by mocking Salafi preachers and people, he did challenge that taboo. Do you think that's going to survive, or do you think that, shall we say, the forces of conservatism are going to reassert themselves on this? Because it seems to me that what's going on, and what you've talked about a lot, is the confronting of taboos. And we've got used to confronting taboos in our country, perhaps, but many people would say we've had to pay a price. You know, and this process seems to me just to be beginning in Egypt.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I mentioned that if Morsi had stayed in power longer, it would have continued. You know, we would have continued unraveling those taboos. I think you're totally right when you say that very few people wanted to confront anything that had to do with Islam, and I think one of the reasons is that, you know, the Mubarak regime was never secular. It was always false to describe it as secular. It wasn't. Maybe Mubarak personally, you know, at home, he and Suzanne were secular, I don't know. But the regime was never secular, and it never pretended to be secular. And if anything, it used a conservative Islam against its conservative Islamist opponents.
Yeah.
And so what it ended up doing to Egypt basically was suffocating us and removing any oxygen from those of us who happened to be in the middle, who wanted to be more liberal, who wanted to be progressive. And so you used to see the most conservative preachers on television. You know, someone like Sheikh Sharawi, who continues to be revered by so many Egyptians, actually people across the whole region. And he was incredibly conservative, but he was put on television during the Mubarak regime because he was their face, right? Mubarak could then say, look, you know, you keep saying that I'm an infidel, that I'm in cahoots with the West, and I maintain this peace treaty with the Zionists and all this kind of this stuff. But look, I've got all these great preachers. You know, he would appoint people at Azhar, he would put preachers on TV who were very conservative, so it was conservative versus conservative. And anyone who tried to confront their taboos, like someone like Farag Foda was assassinated by the Salafis. And then someone like Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, who was one of my own personal heroes, he was chased out of Egypt because a group of fundamentalists took him to court and accused him of being an apostate because of his challenging to conservative thought, and forced him and his wife to divorce. And so he and his wife had to flee to the Netherlands. So you basically suffocated the liberal progressive camp out of any kind of standing with this conservative versus conservative. So that's what we saw in the 90s, and especially when the Mubarak regime was confronting the armed Islamist campaign against it. What it would do is, you know, it would kill the armed Islamists, but it would allow them to just kind of gain more and more ground culturally and socially. So you saw more and more women covering up in Egypt. I mean, as far as the social battle in Egypt, the Islamists won the social battle ages ago. That's why I say that we need a social and a sexual revolution, for me, to undo what the Islamists had done. Because you go to Egypt now and the majority of women are covered up. They won a long time ago because the regime was willing to give us up. You know, as long as it had its own kind of, it was protected, it was using conservative versus conservative. So we needed to confront those taboos, and Bassem Youssef was one of several people confronting them. Now, I think that there's no turning back. There's no way, because I keep kind of likening it to pulling a string, and you're eventually just going to just unravel the whole thing. So Bassem might be gone, but lots of other people continue. And you'll find a lot of online satire, you'll find a lot of satire on the street. Nobody now is free of this kind of this mockery. I mean, there are pictures making the rounds right now. A lot of people are saying that they're photoshopped, but the kind of the impetus behind them is the same. There's a bra with, you know, the Rabah sign. Anyone who supports the Muslim Brotherhood now does the four-finger thing, right? And I'll break the picture up, I'll show it to you. So there are bras making the rounds in the yellow, the colour of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the four fingers on either cup. And then there's blue panties going around with Sisi's face on the crotch. So someone is out there making bras and panties, and they're called Sisi panties and Rabah bras. So this idea that you can mock what used to be unmockable is definitely there, and Bassem was the tip of that, and he was the most prominent tip of that. But it's everywhere, and it's not going to stop. And that's why I mentioned that there is a growing number, kind of a group of people now who are more openly identifying as atheist. That's not so much about the mockery, but that is a taboo as well, to identify as atheist in Egypt. The last time anyone would openly identify as atheist in Egypt was probably back in the 70s, where you had artists and actors and poets who were comfortable saying, I'm atheist, but not in, 80s, 90s Egypt. So it's not gone. And the whole challenging taboo thing comes from wanting to overthrow any kind of authority, this kind of social anarchy in the best possible sense of it, that nobody has a right to silence me anymore, which I think is the longest kind of legacy of this revolution, and which is why I remain optimistic.
I was wondering in that very important issue of family law and politics and separating family law from religion,
Yes.
Where the process might start. Because having looked briefly at the Constitution as it's been approved, I think that this principle has been enshrined in the Constitution that anything to do with family issues is still reserved of the Church. But I was just wondering if you're aware of any of the sort of nascent political parties, and whether there is any kind of work going into these parties, which is sort of almost a blank slate in many cases, to actually put some sort of modest proposals of actually starting that work.
Yeah.
Is anything happening in that area?
Unfortunately not, because that remains still a huge taboo. Anything with women and children that has to do with marriage, inheritance, divorce, that kind of stuff is still a huge taboo and very difficult to touch. I mean, it took women's groups ages to get this idea in the Egyptian parliament in 2000. Is that my phone? No, something is vibrating. In 2000, after at least a decade of efforts by feminist groups in Egypt, the Egyptian parliament passed this thing called khola, which was a woman's right. Oh, where's my phone? I'm sorry. Are you all hearing my phone vibrate? Because I feel like the room's about to explode. This divorce, a woman's right to initiate a divorce, basically kind of remove herself from a marriage, which apparently is an Islamic right, and a woman had a right to do this all along. But it was only enshrined in law in Egypt in 2000, after at least a decade of efforts by feminist groups. But now, because of the way, because of the economy, basically only affluent women can afford to do this, because you have to renounce all financial rights basically that your husband owes you in a divorce if you remove yourself from the marriage. So poor women in Egypt basically are stuck in miserable marriages unless they can get their husband to divorce them, which doesn't always happen. So family law is untouched, but one of our biggest hopes is Lebanon, and to try to follow the Lebanese example, because a few months ago a baby was born and his sect wasn't registered, and that for us, because his parents, I think they got a civil marriage, and they were the first couple to get a civil marriage in Lebanon. That's what we need. We need the ability to have civil marriages in Egypt, and they don't exist for Egyptians. Foreigners can have civil marriages in Egypt, but Egyptian Muslims and Christians can't. So I think one of the things that we have to fight for is, okay, those who want to continue in the religious framework, stay. If you want an Islamic marriage, or if you want a Christian marriage in a church. But those of us who want the civil side of things, we need to start creating that avenue for them. It will remain parallel for a while, and then I don't know how long it will take to just make it civil, but we need to start making that again acceptable as much of a taboo as it is for people, because very few people even question it. That's the problem. And that's why when we have Musawa move to Egypt and have them be headquartered there and have them say things like, look, we have things based on scripture, and we have things based on Islamic tradition that allows you to do X, Y, and Z. A lot of people are waiting for that permission, So while they work on the religious side, I think more and more of us need to work on the secular side and have this idea of a civil marriage and civil law for family start existing and breaking away. But I don't know how long it will take, because that does remain one of the few untouchable areas. Yeah. Yes.
Let's strike each other first, and then next year.
Sorry, you mentioned just there about sort of affluent women, and it was just really a question about how class and sort of status is impacting on women in Egypt being able to speak forward. Is it entirely affluent women who are being able to identify as feminists to be able to move in this, or is it happening across the board?
Right, well, I mean, class obviously has a huge role to play, but interestingly, if you ask most people who are the women and girls who've been on the street during the revolution, and it's not the women of the upper classes. And this I think, this is the kind of one of the biggest things that gives me hope in Egypt, because you're talking about girls and women of, say, the lower middle classes and the working classes that were out there, because they basically have nothing to lose. But here's the thing, I mean, when it comes to misogyny and patriarchy and discrimination against women, it cuts across all lines. Your money does not protect you, your education does not protect you, but it does give you some cushioning. But when it comes to the law, in the case of removing yourself from marriage or khola, your money definitely does protect you. But generally in Egypt, it also will protect you if you can, in the sense that you can get into a car and avoid being groped on the street. But when it comes to attitudes and when it comes to that kind of general sense of patriarchy, it doesn't matter what class you're in. But even if women don't openly identify as feminist, I think for those girls and women who were on the street, that awareness that there is no turning back now, because you, alongside your male, co-revolutionaries, were out on the street confronting something very frightening that no one thought you could confront. But then you realize that they're not always going to be on your side when you're trying to confront your own, your other kind of revolution. That is the most important and interesting change for me that is happening in Egypt. Some of the groups, there's one particular group called Bahia Masr, which I've been a bit close to, and they take volunteers, and I think that for those groups that take volunteers, where they'll have protests that are specifically about pressuring for women's rights, like whenever kind of really horrendous incidents of sexual violence come out, and they call for women to come out and protest. That's how they get a lot of their volunteers. I think this is where, even if you don't identify as a feminist, and regardless of your social class, the fact that you have these groups to go to that you can volunteer with, I think that they will help to spread feminist ideas, whether you identify as feminist or not. And then you also find younger women who are involved in groups like No to Military Trials and others that are not specifically along gender lines, but they're involved in activism anyway. And again, just being involved in that kind of activism in you makes you recognize that you have many levels of activism to go through, because you'll be involved in these groups with your male peers, but you recognize that there's only so much you can achieve as a woman, whereas for them as men, the challenges are a bit different. So I think it's real consciousness changing. Words like consciousness raising and awareness and stuff often mean absolutely nothing, but in regards to countries like Egypt and what's happening on the ground now, it really is. It's like earth-shattering for a lot of these young women, because they're coming face to face to things that for a long time we didn't touch in Egypt, and it was just kind of like, the upper-class elite women, they can afford to talk about feminism. No, but you're now talking about, working-class girls and women who are out there on the street, and no one is going to be able to tell them anything now if they're out there on the street confronting, tanks and armoured personnel carriers,
Yeah, take your question.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just wondering if there can be said to be a kind of a link up across the Middle East. Is there what could be considered feminist networks in the region? And I just wonder, because you're saying it's very, these younger girls, is it visible, we'll say, in social media, and that where people talk about we're doing this here, we're doing that there?
Absolutely. You have groups that are more recent, like the Uprising of the Arab Woman, which has a Facebook page and which is very active on Twitter. And right now, actually, recently, they just launched a campaign on November the 25th, which is the International Day of Against Violence Against Women. They launched a campaign called Hal Ta'lamin, which is the Arabic for "Did you know?" And basically, what it is to expose all the discriminatory laws out there. So, for example, in Egypt, a husband can escape punishment for domestic violence if he proves that he beat his wife with quote-unquote good intent. And good intent means that he doesn't bruise her face or leave any lasting marks. And another one is in Lebanon and other countries, as I mentioned, a rapist can escape conviction, and all that stuff. So their campaign, which they've linked across the region, is to expose all these discriminatory laws that need to obviously be ended and fixed and all that. And then there are other groups, like there's one group called Nasawiya, which is based in Lebanon, and they also have membership, but it's mostly a Lebanese group. There's also a Lebanese group called Meme, which is specifically for lesbian and bisexual women and are transgendered. And Meme was a break-off from Henam, which was the first gay and lesbian group in the region that was also based out of Beirut. But Meme is specifically just for lesbian and bisexual women. They do take women from across the region, but it's mostly Lebanese. But they all have a very strong presence online. And the work they're doing, I think, is that the best thing about what they do for me is they create a sense of community for women who'd always felt marginalized, and for women who never thought that they had this sense of community. And even if they are specifically just in Beirut, the fact that you can reach them on social media, whenever I teach at university, when I do adjunct work, I get my students to interview them. And they will tell them things like, we have a safe house, we have a library, we have all this stuff, and the fact that you can contact them that easily and Skype with them, says that, in the regionally, women can meet them as well. Saudi women have been doing a lot of work using social media and YouTube and stuff like that when they upload videos of themselves breaking the driving ban. So my point basically is, even if they aren't specifically regional groups, they can be found on social media and they can teach and learn from each other because of social media. But there are groups that are regional, like the Uprising of the Arab Woman and Nasawiya, which is the Arabic word for feminism.
Is there still, we'll say, countries that are dominant? We'll say you said a lot of these are Lebanese based.
And Lebanon and Egypt are probably the two most dominant, and that's why you'll find a lot of their activists work together the most, and they'll have most conferences either in Cairo or in Lebanon. And yeah, I think those two are the countries, and sometimes Morocco as well, but it's usually a Lebanese Egyptian thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are we out of time?
Right, we can take another question.
Yes, sure, I think one more. Yeah, just talk about generational conflict. We talk about family, life within the family.
Yes.
Is there a conflict between clearly mothers and daughters? Is that, you were inferring it a little bit, but are the older generations tend to be more conservative?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, everything. A lot of what's been happening in the region now is a reminder that 60% of the region is younger than 30. So, inevitably, this generational thing is going to come about. I mean, this wasn't just a youth revolution. There were people of all ages on the streets of the various countries where you've seen uprisings and revolutions. But when it comes to this social and sexual revolution, definitely. My own family example will have my sister and I both openly identify as feminists, and every now and then a male cousin will come and have dinner with us in our parents' home in Cairo, and we do a 1-2 feminist brainwashing of our male cousins. And bless them, they're very open and receptive to this, and especially those who were out on the street and who took part in the revolution. And so they'll ask us, what is this feminism and what does it mean to you? And my sister and I, will welcome our cousin, and my mother has a PhD in medicine, so she's very educated, but she doesn't identify as a feminist. But for me, she was one of my earliest feminist role models, which again, just because you don't identify as a feminist doesn't mean you're not a feminist. So, in terms of example and real life kind of role model, she was a feminist for me. But my mother would sit there quietly and then she would just explode and she'd be like, what are you talking about? You can't do that in Egypt. What, sex outside of marriage? This is not what the revolution should be about. So, even in my own family, we have these, in all families you have these tensions where you have the older generation that for the longest time took these things for granted and now are watching, younger people openly at least challenge things that they maybe quietly challenge, but now it's been spoken about. And not always things that they welcome, but that's what's happening in Egypt now, and I think it's natural. I think not just in countries that are going through revolutions, and especially for women, I think of my mother's generation and older, who recognized that there were things that they had to say and do in order to survive in this very patriarchal culture and environment. It's a bit difficult and uncomfortable for them to recognize that we don't have to say and do the same things that they did. And that's why, when you talk about things like FGM and others, people often say to you, but it's the women doing it to the girls. It's the mothers who are cutting their daughters' genitals. And it's not because they want to or because they hate their daughters. It's because they recognize that's what's expected of them. And these women of the Muslim Brotherhood, they also recognize that they've given this small amount of room to maneuver in order, to kind of survive in the political environment. But that's why a lot of these older women now are looking at younger ones saying, even saying and doing what I used to, and pushing. There was someone back here who wanted to ask a question from the beginning. The gentleman in the blazer. I know you wanted to ask something.
Yeah,
yes.
Hi, Mara. You said that the best way to try and influence from the outside is to try and focus on the fact that they give aid to Egypt.
Yes.
And would you say that's the main way to do it? Because I can think of a few problems. I mean, for example, if we're talking about, firstly you have to define exactly what do we want from those countries in terms of rights for women. Are we saying that we should say that the government should not give aid until they have a quota in parliament or something like that? And that's related to the second problem, which is that in some cases, even if a government looks fairly progressive in terms of women's rights, for example, India does, they still have horrific levels of violence against women.
Yes.
And we still give aid to India, and it's very difficult to argue that aid to India should be predicated on women's rights, because they'll just turn around and say, well, what do you want us to do? So I'm just trying to think how exactly can we figure this one out, because it seems like a vague thing to say, but it's not clear how exactly we specify that.
Well, I think that this is where a lot of the homegrown groups or the grassroots groups there can help a lot, because they all have certain kind of agendas and timetables of achievements and demands that they have of their own governments or regimes that I think the various countries who do give aids can consult with. But one of the easiest ways that anything I say can basically be challenged is that, okay, a lot of these countries can say, well, we don't want your aid because the Saudis will give us money, and the Saudis will never say, this is predicated on women's rights, because the Saudis don't give two shakes about women's rights, And that's what's happening in Egypt right now. Whenever the Americans say, we're going to cut off aid, well, the Sisi now says, well, I'm getting money from the Saudis and the Emiratis, and the Russians are going to send me weapons. So I know what I'm saying, is on shaky grounds. But the point that I'm making is that just as a lot of governments will say we have a so-called ethical foreign policy, and if you torture people and if you have so many numbers of political prisoners, we're not going to give you aid. I want women's rights to be included in that. I don't have specific things, because I think it's those women's groups on the ground that will be able to give you the specific things that they're calling for. But I just want this idea to be out there, that you recognize women's rights as important as human rights violations and as kind of progressive rights generally. When it comes to countries like India, you're absolutely right. That is the biggest problem, and it's one of the biggest problems for us, because I look to India and I look, say, to sub-Saharan African countries and other countries that are trying to develop a more progressive women's rights agenda. And I guess when it comes to India, it's more about actually implementing the law rather than putting a law into place, because you have the law. We don't even have the law. We're starting from a much kind of lower point. But I would like to learn from more sub-Saharan African countries and how they've managed, because we have very similar problems, but unfortunately in Egypt we rarely regard ourselves as African. We're Arab above everything else, and sometimes we have more in common with our African neighbours than we do with our so-called Arab neighbours, and we need to learn from them. And countries that the countries that have women as prime ministers now and women as foreign ministers, how did they get their women involved in politics? Other than, say, Rwanda, because they lost so many men, so they have many more women in the actual kind of political arena. I would like to learn from other countries that have had similar challenges to us. So I recognise what I'm saying is on shaky grounds generally, because you could just say, well, I don't want your money, I'll get it from someone else. I just want women's rights to be recognised as importantly as, say, torture and human rights violations to be.
Well, on behalf of Caabu, I'd like to thank Mona for speaking so eloquently today, and indeed Samira for you having participated as well. John will remember I chaired a meeting at Care International not that long ago, a few weeks ago, and it was about women in Egypt, and I said, what I say now is that I think one of the reasons why men in the region are so scared about women's rights is the incredibly talented and brave and wonderful women that there are, who are actually in many ways quite intimidating to them, I think, in certain circumstances. And I think Mona is one of those talented spokespeople for women's rights, and all power to you in everything that you do. Having just come back from Egypt, I'm very acutely aware of the challenges faced, and even when I lived there in the 1990s, the harassment of women was really pretty appalling, it has to be said. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, Mona, for coming along, and it's always a pleasure to have you. I hope you'll come back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.